Nobody was laughing at the end of that Tuesday morning in Harlan County, but they were laughing at the beginning. That is the part worth understanding first, the laughter, what it meant, who it came from, and why a 16-year-old boy named Cal Mercer did not stop moving when he heard it. He heard it. That much is certain. The sound carried across the preview yard the way sound carries on a flat Kansas morning in late July when the air is already thick before 9 o'clock, and there is nowhere for anything to go except outward. The laughter came from a cluster of men near the water tank on the east side of the Harlan Sale barnyard. Men who had been buying and selling farm equipment in this county since before Cal was born. Men who knew what they were looking at when they looked at things. They thought they knew what they were looking at when they looked at him. What they were looking at was a boy, lanky, sunburned at the neck and forearms in the particular way that farm boys get sunburned, where the line between covered and uncovered skin is sharp and permanent looking. Work boots that were slightly too large, bought a size ahead because his mother believed in buying ahead, and because Cal had not yet grown fully into the frame that his grandfather's side of the family tended toward tall men, who arrived at their height gradually and kept it for a long time. A notebook in his left hand, a flashlight in his right, though it was full daylight and the morning sun was already doing what July suns do in Kansas, which is everything. A compression gauge hanging from a loop on his belt, the kind of gauge that looked like it had been used for 40 years because it had been. He was moving through the rows of equipment in the preview yard the way serious buyers move through the rows of equipment in the preview yard, methodically, stopping at each unit, crouching to look at undercarriages, checking fluid levels, peering under hoods, writing things down in the notebook with a pencil that he kept behind his right ear when he was not using it and retrieved without looking when he needed it. He was 16 years old. The men near the water tank found this improbable enough to be funny. It was not mean laughter. It was the laughter of people who have seen the world organize itself in certain predictable ways for long enough that a disruption to that organization strikes them as absurd rather than threatening. A boy doing what serious buyers do. A boy with a compression gauge on his belt as if it belonged there, which for most boys his age it did not. A boy at a farm equipment auction with a flashlight in full daylight, taking it as seriously as a man twice his age and 3 times his experience would take it, moving through the rows with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who has come here for a specific purpose and intends to accomplish it. Dex Holbrook was the one who said it out loud. Holbrook ran a used equipment dealership out of a lot on Route 9 and had been coming to the Harlan Sale Barn auction twice a year for 14 years. He was the kind of man who carried his authority quietly, the kind who did not need to announce what he knew, because what he knew was visible in how he moved and what he looked at and how long he looked at it. When Holbrook stopped at a piece of equipment, it meant the equipment was worth stopping at. When he moved on after 30 seconds, it meant he had seen what he needed to see, and the verdict was not favorable. 14 years of auction mornings had made his assessments fast and reliable, in the way that repetition makes things fast and reliable when the underlying judgment is sound. He watched Cal for a moment from across the yard. "Somebody's boy," Holbrook said, playing farmer. A few men within earshot agreed with the assessment. The laughter moved through the group the way laughter moves through a group of men who are comfortable with each other and with their shared understanding of how things are supposed to work, and then it dissipated the way laughter does when it has made its point and there is other business to attend to. Cal Mercer heard every word of it. He did not stop moving. He turned the page in his notebook and kept working. That decision to hear it and keep moving was not made in that moment. It had been made years earlier in a different kind of quiet, in a wooden equipment shed outside of Oakley, Kansas, by a man named Earl Mercer, who was teaching his grandson something that had nothing to do with farm machinery and everything to do with it at the same time. Earl had never said anything directly about what to do when people underestimated you. He had not needed to. He had demonstrated it every day of his working life by doing the work in front of him with his full attention and letting the work speak for what it was worth. And Cal had absorbed that demonstration the way you absorb things that are shown to you repeatedly across the years of your formation. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The Harlan Sale Barn ran its auction twice a year, spring and late summer, off the county highway about 3 miles east of town. It was the kind of event that drew serious buyers from 3 counties, farmers liquidating equipment after retirement estates being settled by families who knew the value of things in general, but not the value of specific machines, and dealers looking for units to recondition and move. It also drew a general population of onlookers who came the way people come to any event where something interesting might happen, not because they expected anything in particular, but because the possibility of something in particular was enough. The late summer 1977 auction had 63 registered bidders and an unofficial crowd of spectators that filled the shaded west side of the yard by mid-morning and made the east side, which had no shade and full sun by 9 o'clock, feel even more uncomfortable than it already was. Cal Mercer arrived at 7:30 in the morning. Registration did not open until 8:30. He had ridden his bicycle 14 miles from his family's farm outside of Oakley, leaving the house before 6 in the morning while the air was still cool enough to make the ride bearable, and the roads were empty enough that he could stay to the edge and make good time. His mother needed the truck for a dentist appointment in Colby that she had been putting off for 2 months and could not reasonably put off again. Cal had not asked her to change the appointment. He had looked at the calendar 3 days earlier, looked at the auction date, looked at the distance from the farm to the Harlan sale barn, done the arithmetic on departure time and arrival time, and gotten up early enough to make it work without anyone having to adjust anything on his account. This was characteristic. Cal Mercer did not ask people to rearrange themselves on his behalf if there was a way to handle things himself. This was not stubbornness. It was a form of respect for other people's time and plans that had been instilled in him by a grandfather who believed that self-reliance was not a personality trait, but a moral position, a statement about your relationship to the world and to the people in it. He locked the bicycle to a fence post at the edge of the parking area, the kind of careful locking that suggested he intended to come back to it and expected it to be there when he did. He smoothed his shirt with both hands, the reflexive self-presentation of a young man who understood that how you arrive at a place communicates something about how seriously you intend to take what happens there. He picked up his notebook and his grandfather's flashlight and walked into the preview yard. He had 1 hour before registration opened. He intended to use all of it. The preview yard held 47 lots that morning. Grain augers in various states of working order. Planters with worn components that would need attention before the next planting season. A post hole digger with a bent shaft that someone had tried to straighten and had not quite succeeded. A John Deere B with an engine that needed a full rebuild, which the auction catalog noted plainly and honestly, because the Harlan sale barn had a reputation for honest disclosure that it protected carefully. A Farmall H that looked better than it probably was, the paint freshened at some point in the recent past, in the way that paint gets freshened when someone wants to move something and knows that appearance affects price. 2 hay balers in varying states of disrepair. Miscellaneous implements stacked near the back fence, in the way that miscellaneous things get stacked when the people stacking them are thinking about getting them out of the way, more than about the people who will eventually need to assess them. Cal moved through all of it with the same systematic attention, but he already knew what he was looking for and where it was. He had studied the auction catalog for 3 evenings before this morning, reading it at the workbench in the equipment shed under the hanging light that Earl had wired in 1963 and that Cal had rewired in 1976 when the original wiring began to show the kind of wear that makes electrical systems unreliable. He had a list in his notebook written in the precise small handwriting that his grandfather had always said was the mark of a person who was serious about keeping track of things. 3 lots on the list. 1 lot circled twice the circle drawn with enough pressure that it was visible from the impression on the page beneath. Lot 14. The 1953 Oliver 88 row crop tractor sat at the end of the north row, and it looked the way machines look when they have been used hard and maintained reluctantly, and then not maintained at all, and then left to sit somewhere that was not quite inside, but was not quite outside either. Somewhere that gave them exposure to moisture and temperature change without the full assault of weather, which is in some ways worse than full exposure, because it prolongs the deterioration rather than accelerating it to a conclusion. The paint was mostly gone on the hood, and the fenders not peeled but worn the way paint wears when it has been in contact with work and weather across enough seasons. 1 rear fender was missing entirely the bolt holes where it had attached rusted into orange rings that looked like targets. The seat had been replaced at some point with a piece of plywood that someone had shaped roughly with a saw and bolted into the mounting bracket with hardware that was wrong for the application but was what they had available at the time they did it. The front axle was visibly off-center, not severely, not the kind of off-center that suggested a catastrophic impact or a rollover, or the kind of structural failure that happens when a machine is used beyond what it was designed to handle. But enough. Enough that if you were standing 20 feet away and you looked at the front end of the tractor, and then looked at the rear end, and then looked at the front end again, something would register as incorrect in the way that things register as incorrect when they violate a proportion that the eye has learned to expect. The kind of incorrectness that experienced eyes catch without necessarily knowing in that first moment exactly what they are catching, the way an experienced driver notices that something is wrong with the road surface a moment before they can name what is wrong with it. It was the kind of off-center that made serious buyers walk away from lot 14 after 30 seconds. Dex Holbrook had looked at it for exactly 30 seconds. Cal had watched him from 2 rows away, tracking Holbrook's movement through the preview yard with a portion of his attention while keeping the rest on the equipment directly in front of him. Holbrook had walked to the front of the Oliver, looked at the axle with the direct assessing gaze of a man who has looked at a great many front axles and knows immediately what a problematic one looks like. Looked at the auction catalog sheet he was carrying, made a note on it with the pen he kept in his chest pocket, and moved on to the next lot without crouching down, without checking under the hood, without doing any of the things he did with equipment he was seriously considering. 30 seconds. A man with 14 years of experience and a genuinely good eye, a man whose assessments had been validated repeatedly across hundreds of transactions, had looked at lot 14 for 30 seconds and decided it was not worth his time. Cal Mercer spent 22 minutes on it. He started with the engine because the engine was what determined whether everything else was worth considering. He lifted the hood, which resisted at first with the particular resistance of hinges that have not moved in a long time and have developed a light rust at the pivot points, and then gave all at once with the suddenness of things that have been holding out longer than they should have. He looked at what was under the hood with the flashlight, even though the morning light was sufficient, because the flashlight showed him things at angles that daylight did not reveal. The interior surfaces of components that were in shadow allowed him to see what he was looking for, rather than what the ambient light chose to show him. He checked the oil. The level was adequate, and the color was the dark brown of oil that had been in service for a full season without being changed, which told him the engine had been running within the recent past and had not been sitting dry, which was important. He checked the coolant, which was low, but present another data point in the picture he was assembling. He examined the carburetor for obvious problems: stuck, float-damaged needle seat, cracked body, and found none. He noted the condition of the air cleaner, which was clogged with the accumulated chaff and dust of several seasons of field work and would need cleaning or replacement, which was minor and expected on a machine of this age and condition. Then he got out his grandfather's compression gauge. This was the moment when some of the men in the preview yard began to pay attention to him in a way that was different from the earlier laughter. A boy using a compression gauge at a farm equipment auction preview, actually using it, not holding it for show, not mimicking the gestures of someone who knew what they were doing, but running the test with the methodical competence of someone who had done it many times, was unusual enough to watch. The way you watch anything that doesn't fit the expected pattern of a familiar event, because the thing that doesn't fit either reveals itself as a mistake or reveals the pattern as incomplete, and you want to know which. Cal ran the compression check the way Earl had taught him, which was the way it needed to be run to produce reliable information. Systematically. All 4 cylinders in order, with the engine cranked through the same number of revolutions for each test to ensure the readings were comparable. He recorded each number in his notebook as he took it. Cylinder 1. A pause while he wrote the number. Cylinder 2. Another pause. Cylinder 3. Cylinder 4. He did not rush the recording because a number recorded in haste is a number that might be wrong, and a wrong number is worse than no number because it creates false confidence. He looked at the 4 numbers in his notebook. They were consistent with each other within a range that indicated an engine with reasonable internal condition, not rebuilt, not like new, but not on the edge of failure either. An engine that had more work left in it if it was maintained going forward. He wrote a single word beneath the numbers, a private assessment that meant something specific to him, and then he moved on. He checked the transmission through the inspection cover, removing it carefully and setting it aside where it would not get kicked or stepped on, and looking at the gear cluster with the flashlight while he turned the input shaft by hand and felt for the kind of roughness that indicates gear damage or bearing failure. He felt none. The gears moved with the slight stiffness of components that had been sitting, but without the grinding resistance of components that had been damaged. He checked the hydraulics with a length of baling wire he had brought in his back pocket for exactly this purpose, a trick Earl had shown him when he was 12, pressing the wire against each hydraulic fitting and watching the behavior of the oil film to assess line pressure and seal condition. Then he got under the tractor, not partially under, fully under on his back in the dirt of the preview yard, with the flashlight held in his right hand and angled upward at the front axle assembly from directly below. He had laid his notebook on the ground beside him where he could reach it. He looked at the kingpin assembly from below with the same complete attention he had brought to everything else. Not hurrying because someone might be watching him and thinking it was funny. Not hurrying because the barn opened for registration in 40 minutes. Not hurrying because the July sun was making the dirt under the tractor warmer than was comfortable against his back. He looked at what he had come to look at. Then he took the folding ruler from his shirt pocket and made two measurements, one at the upper kingpin housing and one at the wheel flange, recording both in his notebook before he slid back out from under the tractor. He stood up. He brushed the dirt from the back of his shirt and the back of his jeans with the automatic efficiency of a person who has gotten out from under machinery in work clothes before and knows the routine. He looked at the front axle one more time from a standing position, confirming what the measurement had confirmed, and then he looked at his notebook one more time, and then he wrote something below the measurements. He closed the notebook. He walked to the registration table. The registration table was staffed by a woman named Berta Calloway, who had been running the Harlan Sale Barn registration process for 11 years, and who had across those 11 years developed a comprehensive and largely accurate sense of which registered bidders were going to be consequential to the morning's auction and which were going to register and then stand near the fence watching without ever raising their hand. She had the quiet organizational competence of someone who is very good at a job that most people do not think requires competence, the kind of person who keeps a complicated process running smoothly and is noticed only when something goes wrong, which under her management it rarely did. Cal gave his name. Cal Mercer, outside Oakley. He gave his address, which she wrote down without looking up. He gave his age, which caused her to look up not with alarm or disapproval, but with the brief recalibration of someone who has received information that is slightly outside the normal range of what they receive and is noting it before returning to the process. 16. She wrote it down and returned to the form. Cal placed his coffee tin on the table. It was an actual coffee tin. A Folgers can with the plastic lid pressed back on the kind of container that had been used to store things in farm households across rural America for generations, because it was the right size for small amounts of things, and it was free, and it was sturdy, and it sealed. Berta opened the lid and counted the contents with the practiced efficiency of someone who has counted a great deal of money across a table over the course of 11 years. $340 in denominations that told a story, if you were inclined to read it, mostly fives and tens. Some ones in a single $20 bill that had been placed at the bottom of the stack as if it had been set aside from the rest and added later. She counted it twice, which was standard procedure, and wrote the total on the registration form. She wrote him a bidder number on a slip of paper and handed it across the table. He folded the slip carefully once lengthwise and once across and put it in his shirt pocket where it would be accessible without having to search for it. "Good luck," Berta said. She said it to everyone in the same tone as a matter of form rather than sentiment. "Thank you," Cal said. He said it as if he meant it specifically because he did. Dex Holbrook had watched the coffee tin get counted from 20 feet away. He had been watching Cal since the compression gauge in the preview yard, not obsessively, but with the peripheral attention of a man whose livelihood depends on noticing things that don't quite fit and understanding what they mean. He watched Cal fold the bidder paper and put it in his shirt pocket. He shook his head slowly in the way of a man who has seen the gap between intention and resources before and has a clear sense of how such gaps tend to resolve. He did not know how this particular gap would resolve. Nobody in that yard did, except in the way that mattered most Cal. And Cal did not know the ending either. He knew something more important than the ending. He knew the middle. Here is what Cal Mercer knew and how he came to know it and why it mattered in ways that extended far beyond a single Tuesday morning in a farm auction yard in Harlan County, Kansas. He was born in 1961 in a farmhouse outside Oakley, the youngest of 3 children and the only one of them who had, from roughly the age of 8, followed his grandfather into the equipment shed with the focused and voluntary attention of a student who has found the subject that makes sense of everything else. His older siblings found the equipment shed noisy and greasy and without sufficient appeal to justify the time. Cal found it complete. Everything in the equipment shed operated according to principles that were discoverable and learnable. Every problem had a cause, and every cause had a fix, and every fix was within reach if you were willing to pay the kind of attention that finding things requires. The world outside the shed was more complicated and less tractable. The shed made sense. Earl Mercer had farmed 240 acres in Thomas County for 40 years and had maintained his own equipment for all 40 of those years without exception. Not because he could not afford to hire mechanics, though there were years when the economics of farming in that part of Kansas made every expenditure a calculation. He maintained his own equipment because he believed with the quiet conviction of a man who has thought something through completely and arrived at a conclusion he trusts, that a farmer who cannot fix his own machines is a farmer at the mercy of someone else's schedule and someone else's assessment of what constitutes urgency. Earl Mercer had a low tolerance for being at the mercy of circumstances he could control by acquiring the knowledge that the circumstances required. He was also in the specific way that matters in this story, not a man who explained himself at length. Earl taught the way farm knowledge gets transmitted when it works, which is not the way it gets transmitted in classrooms or workshops or any setting where transmission is the official purpose. He taught with proximity. He let Cal be present while he worked, and being present while Earl worked meant watching and handing tools when tools were needed, and gradually through accumulation, rather than instruction, building an understanding of what was being done and why it was being done that way, and what the consequences of doing it differently would be. Cal learned what different engine sounds meant the way a person learns a language when they are living inside it, not by studying the rules in sequence, but by absorbing the patterns until the patterns become instinct and the instinct becomes reliable. Earl was precise in everything he did. Not slow. There is an important difference between a slow man and a precise one. A slow man takes his time because he is uncertain of his next move and needs the time to figure it out. Earl took his time because he had learned across 4 decades of keeping old machinery running through the conditions that Kansas farming puts machinery through, that the cost of doing something wrong was almost always higher than the cost of doing it right the first time, and that the difference between right and wrong was usually attention rather than skill. Skill could be acquired. Attention had to be chosen repeatedly against the competing pull of impatience and the illusion that speed and thoroughness were in conflict with each other when they were not. He brought full attention to whatever was in front of him. He expected the same from anyone working beside him, and he communicated this expectation not by stating it, but by maintaining it himself in a way that made its absence conspicuous. By the time Cal was 12, Earl trusted him with compression checks, which require both the mechanical knowledge to perform the test correctly and the interpretive knowledge to understand what the numbers mean. By 13, with carburetor rebuilds, which require patience with small components and the ability to work in a defined sequence without losing your place. By 14, with valve adjustments, which require a combination of precision and patience that most adults struggle to sustain for the duration of a full adjustment procedure, and that Cal had in a form that Earl privately, and without saying it to Cal, recognized as something beyond what training alone could produce. Earl died in the spring of 1976 when Cal was 14 years old. He was 71, and he had worked until the week before he went into the hospital, and he did not come back out. He left behind his farm, which would continue to be farmed, and his tools and 40 years of accumulated knowledge stored in 2 places in the wooden tool chest he had built himself in 1941, a solid piece of joinery work that had held up as well as anything Earl had ever built, because Earl had built it to hold up and had maintained it accordingly across 35 years, and in the binders on the shelf above the main workbench in the equipment shed, which held every technical bulletin, every service notice, every specification sheet and repair procedure that any manufacturer had sent him or that he had obtained across 40 years of keeping machines running. He did not leave a letter. He did not leave instructions about the tools or the binders or what Cal was supposed to do with either. He left the tools and the binders and trusted in the way that men of his particular disposition trust that what he had given across 8 years of proximity was sufficient instruction for what came after. Cal was 14 years old. He had known Earl his entire life. He had spent more consecutive hours in the equipment shed with Earl than he had spent in almost any other single place. And now the shed was full of Earl's things, and completely empty of Earl, and the silence of a place that used to contain someone you loved and no longer does is a particular kind of silence that a 14-year-old boy is not equipped to process through any means other than being inside it and waiting for it to become something he could carry. He spent a great deal of time in the equipment shed in the months after Earl died. He started reading the binders. Not systematically at first. He would pull a binder off the shelf at random or not quite at random. He would pull the ones that looked most used, whose spines showed the most wear from being taken down and replaced many times over many years. And he would sit on the wooden stool at the end of the workbench and read in the way that you read things when you are not reading for information, but for the feeling of being somewhere specific. Earl had touched every one of these binders. Earl had read every one of these pages, many of them more than once, and had written in the margins in the careful handwriting that Cal knew as well as he knew his own. Reading the pages meant being inside Earl's attention in a form that was still present and legible, and organized even though the man himself was gone. And that was worth something that Cal could not have named at 14, but that he understood in the way that 14-year-olds understand things that are too large for the words they currently have. He read them all. It took most of a year reading in the evenings after the farm work was done, and the house had settled into whatever quiet it settled into, which was a different quiet than the shed's quiet, but quiet nonetheless. The Oliver binders were the ones Cal spent the most time with, partly because Earl had spent the most time with them. The wear on their spines was the most pronounced. The marginal notes, the densest, as if the Oliver equipment had been Earl's particular area of sustained interest, the manufacturer whose machines he had engaged with most completely over the decades. The binder for the Oliver 88 was the thickest of all of them. In the winter of 1976, nearly a year after Earl died, and 7 months before the Harlan sale barn auction, Cal reached a section of the Oliver 88 binder that contained a service bulletin dated 1956. The bulletin was 3 pages long and described in the specific technical language of manufacturer service communications an issue that appeared in the 1952 and 1953 model year Oliver 88 row crop tractors. A design tolerance in the front axle kingpin assembly that under certain conditions of wear that developed gradually over years of normal operation caused the front axle to develop a visible lateral tilt, a cant that was measurable at the wheel flange and visible to any eye that was paying attention to the front-end geometry of the machine. The bulletin described the tilt in precise terms. It gave the range of measurements that indicated the condition. It explained clearly and without hedging that the tilt was caused by wear in the kingpin bushing, a component that could be replaced for a parts cost in the range of $12 at any Oliver implement supplier, and a labor investment of 2 to 3 hours by a mechanic who had read the procedure. It explained that the front axle itself, in cases where the tilt measured within the specified range, was structurally undamaged. It was not bent. It had not been in an impact. The tilt was a symptom of bushing wear, not of anything that affected the structural integrity of the axle, and a buyer who assumed the axle was bent because the tilt looked like what a bent axle looks like was making an error that the bulletin had been written specifically to prevent. Earl had read this bulletin in 1956, the year it was issued. He had made a note in the margin in his careful handwriting, in the red pen he kept in his chest pocket, for things he considered important enough to mark in a way that would be visible when he came back to the page. The note was 6 words. They'll always think it's the axle. And below it 4 more. It never is. Cal read those 2 lines several times. He read the technical description again, working through the mechanical explanation of how the bushing wear created the play in the kingpin assembly that resulted in the lateral shift. The way a door hangs crooked when the hinge screws work loose over time, not broken, not damaged, just loose in a way that looks broken to anyone who doesn't know to check the hinges. He understood the mechanism completely. He understood why the tilt would read as impact damage to anyone who had not specifically read this bulletin and learned this failure mode. He understood that Earl had known this for 20 years before Cal found. It had known it well enough to write a summary of it in 6 words that captured the practical implication more efficiently than the 3 pages of technical language that preceded it. He put the information in the part of his mind where specific knowledge lives, which is a different location from where general knowledge lives and functions differently. General knowledge is approximate and contextual useful across a range of situations, but not definitive in any particular one. Specific knowledge has a shape and a measurement and a defined condition. It does not shift with context. It does not require interpretation in the moment of application because the interpretation has already been done. It sits exactly where you put it, and it is there when you need it in the precise form in which you stored it. 7 months later, in the preview yard of the Harlan sale barn, he put a folding ruler under the front axle of a 1953 Oliver 88-row crop tractor and took two measurements, 4¼ inches of lateral cant at the wheel flange. The bulletin said 4 to 4½ inches indicates kingpin bushing wear. Not structural damage, not a bent axle, bushing wear. Cal closed his ruler. He knew what he had. He knew what every other person in that yard did not know. He knew what Dex Holbrook, with 14 years of experience and a genuinely good eye and a track record of sound assessments, did not know. He knew what Cutter Vance, who had been buying farm equipment for parts since before Cal started school, and who knew the extractable value of most components on most machines in this yard, to within $10, did not know. He knew what Gord Lassiter, who had been calling auctions at this barn for 8 years, and who had seen a great deal of farm equipment come through in that time, did not know. He knew because Earl Mercer had read a service bulletin in 1956 and written 6 words in the margin in red ink and left the binder on the shelf in an equipment shed in Thomas County, Kansas, where a grieving 14-year-old boy would eventually pull it off the shelf on a winter evening and read it not for the information it contained, but for the company of a man who was no longer there to provide company in any other form. The information had come along with the company. That is how it usually works when it works at all. Cal walked back to the registration table and placed his coffee tin on the surface in front of Berta Calloway, and Berta counted $340 and wrote him a bidder number on a slip of paper, and he folded the slip and put it in his shirt pocket where he could reach it without looking. The $340 in the coffee tin was not money in the way that money is money when you have more of it than you need for immediate purposes. It was the accumulated total of what Cal Mercer had been able to put together across 2 years and several months of work that he had done without charging for it, because he had not yet arrived at the point of thinking about his time in terms of what it cost other people, and then was paid for anyway, because the people he had helped were the kind of people who do not accept assistance without eventually finding a way to make it right on their own terms. After Earl died in the spring of 1976, the maintenance of the Mercer farm equipment fell to Cal. 2 tractors, a combine, a planter, and the various implements that went with them. All of it his responsibility now, all of it dependent on his ability to keep it running through the seasons when running was what the farm required. He was 14 years old. He did the work the way Earl had taught him, methodically and without shortcuts, because shortcuts in machinery maintenance are cost deferred to a later moment, when the deferred cost arrives with interest, usually at the worst possible time. The neighboring farms noticed. The Aldridge operation to the north had a hay baler that had been causing problems for a season and a half, intermittently failing to tie properly in a way that wasted time and hay, and the patience of everyone who depended on it. They brought the problem to Cal not because they expected much from a 15-year-old, but because they had run out of other options, and Cal was available and had a reputation, small and local, and knew for knowing his way around equipment. Cal diagnosed the problem in 20 minutes and fixed it in 2 hours. The issue was a worn cam follower in the knotter mechanism, a component that cost $4 and required knowing where to look, which was the part that had defeated the people who had looked at it before. Cal did not charge anything. He was 15 and had not yet constructed a framework for thinking about what his time was worth in dollars. The Plunkett operation 2 farms east had a tractor with an intermittent starting problem that had defeated the dealer's service technician on 2 separate service calls. Cal found it in 45 minutes. A carburetor needle that was seating inconsistently due to a worn seat surface, a problem that presented differently depending on ambient temperature and fuel level in the bowl, which made it impossible to reproduce reliably in a shop environment, but entirely findable if you understood the relationship between those variables and observed the conditions under which the failure appeared. He did not charge for that either. But one evening in the autumn of 1976, Aldridge came to the Mercer place and found Cal in the shed and handed him an envelope without a lot of preamble. Inside was cash, not a large amount. Enough. He said it was for the baler work and everything else. Cal did not know what to say. "You put it away," Aldridge said. "You'll need it for something." Then Plunkett did the same thing separately 2 weeks later in the same understated way, as if they had not discussed it, but had arrived independently at the same conclusion about what was right. Then a third neighbor, a man named Waverly, who had a farm on the south side of the county road, and whom Cal had helped twice over the summer with a cultivator problem that kept recurring until Cal figured out what was actually causing it, rather than addressing only the symptoms. The amounts were modest and different from each other, as if each man had calculated what seemed appropriate according to his own sense of things. Cal put all of it in the coffee tin that sat on the shelf in the equipment shed above the binders, and he did not tell his mother the total because he was not sure how to explain it, and because Aldridge had said to put it away, and he was following that instruction as given. The total by the morning of the Harlan sale barn auction was $340. Not pocket money. Not the enthusiasm of a boy who has not yet learned what things cost and what they are worth. It was 2 years of work concentrated into cash, and every dollar of it was attached in some direct or indirect way to something Earl had taught him about how to look at a machine and what to look for when he looked and what to do when he found it. He placed it on the registration table. Berta counted it. She gave him a slip of paper with a bidder number on it. He folded the slip and put it in his shirt pocket. Dex Holbrook watched all of this from 20 feet away and shook his head once slowly and said something to the man standing beside him that Cal was too far away to hear clearly. Whatever it was fit the pattern of the morning. The boy who should not have been there doing the things that boys did not do at farm equipment auctions with a coffee tin of cash that experienced men found incongruous in the hands that were holding it. Cal heard the laughter when it came and heard whatever came after it, and did not stop moving because the laughter was not relevant to the compression numbers he had recorded in his notebook, or to the measurement of 4¼ inches he had written below those numbers, or to the 6 words that Earl Mercer had written in red ink in 1956 and left on a shelf in Thomas County, Kansas, for whoever came after him and was willing to read what was there. The auction started at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning in late July. Cal Mercer stood near Lot 14 and waited. The auctioneer's name was Gord Lassiter, and he had been calling auctions at the Harlan sale barn for 8 years with the voice and cadence of a man who understood that his job was not merely to announce prices, but to create the conditions under which people would make decisions they had not fully made before entering the yard. He was genuinely good at this. He had a rhythm that pulled the room forward without appearing to push it, that made silence feel like an opportunity cost, and participation feel like the natural and comfortable choice. And he moved through lots with the efficiency of someone who respected both sellers and buyers enough not to waste the morning that all of them had arranged their lives to be present for. The auction opened at 9 with Lot 1. A grain auger in working condition went for $180 to a farmer from the east side of the county who had driven 40 minutes specifically for it and knew to within $20 what he was willing to pay. Lot 2, a 3-point hitch blade in reasonable shape, went for $65 to a man who needed one and recognized the price as fair. Lot 3, a set of disc harrow sections still serviceable, went for $110 after a brief contest between 2 bidders who both wanted them and both knew what they were worth, which made the bidding efficient and a little tense, in the way that bidding is tense when the people involved are serious. Cal stood near the north row and watched, not the equipment being sold, the buyers. He watched how Dex Holbrook positioned himself through the yard as the lots progressed, moving slightly ahead of each upcoming lot in the sequence, the way a man moves when he has already formed his assessment in the preview and is now simply waiting for the price to reach a point that matches it. Holbrook bid on Lot 4, a John Deere cultivator in good condition, and got it at $320 after the one other serious bidder flinched at $300. Holbrook did not flinch. He raised his card without changing his expression, which was the expression of a man who has already decided what something is worth and is not going to pay more than that, regardless of what the room does around him. He bid on Lot 7 as well, a PTO-driven haymower with a cracked gearbox that Lassiter disclosed honestly from the podium in the way that Lassiter disclosed everything. Holbrook got it at $40, which was the price of the parts he could extract from it before the gearbox made the whole machine uneconomical as a running unit. He knew that going in. He had calculated it in the preview. The $40 was the conclusion of arithmetic that he had done before the bidding started, not the beginning of guesswork. Cal watched all of this and understood what he was looking at. Holbrook was operating from knowledge organized into certainty, the way knowledge becomes certainty when you have applied it correctly enough times that the application no longer requires deliberate thought. 14 years of this market had given him a precision that expressed itself as confidence, because it was confidence, the earned kind, the kind that does not need to announce itself, because it is visible in the consistency of the outcomes it produces. This was the man who had walked away from lot 14 after 30 seconds. That remained significant to Cal. Not because it made Holbrook wrong in general. Holbrook was clearly not wrong in general, as the morning was demonstrating. But because it meant that even 14 years of well-organized knowledge had a boundary, a point at which the knowledge ran out, and what existed beyond it was invisible. And Cal was standing on the other side of that boundary in the particular location that mattered this morning. The lots came up in order. Lot 8, Lot 9, a two-row planter that went for $440 after 4 bidders, worked it up in increments of $20 with the careful, controlled aggression of people who want something and are trying not to show how much. Lot 10, a Farmall H with front-end wear that Lassiter described as needing attention. 3 bidders took it to $280 before 2 dropped out. Lot 11, Lot 12, Lot 13, a disc plow with 1 broken gang that went to a man who had a welding setup and the time to fix it. The morning was moving. The shade on the west side had filled entirely. The east side was uncomfortable in the way that July east sides of sale barns in Kansas are uncomfortable by mid-morning. Lassiter maintained his cadence and his energy with the consistency of a professional who understands that his performance is not optional. Cal did not move to the shade. He had been aware of Cutter Vance since the preview in the specific way that you become aware of a person who is looking at the same things you are looking at, but for different reasons. Vance was a compact man in his mid-40s with the physical stillness that comes from having learned at some point that unnecessary movement is a form of waste, and that all waste is a cost. He wore work clothes that were maintained without being new, which was a specific kind of maintenance that communicated seriousness about the work, rather than about the appearance of doing it. He carried a clipboard with a yellow legal pad and made notes on it with a mechanical pencil, which meant he was doing arithmetic and keeping it organized, which meant he knew his numbers before the bidding started. He had spent time at Lot 14 in the preview. Not 22 minutes, but more than 30 seconds. Vance was not categorizing the tractor the way Holbrook was categorizing it. Holbrook was looking for units he could recondition and resell. Vance was looking for components he could extract and sell individually. Those are fundamentally different calculations that lead to different assessments of the same machine. The tilted front axle affected Holbrook's calculation fatally because a reconditioning operation cannot recondition a machine with a damaged structural component without replacing that component, and the cost of replacing it added to the acquisition cost, and the reconditioning cost made the number stop working. So Holbrook walked away after 30 seconds. Vance's calculation was different. Vance was not going to drive the tractor. Vance was not going to recondition it. Vance was going to remove the engine, which was a 4-cylinder Oliver gasoline unit that he had tested by ear in the preview and found acceptable, and the transmission, which was one of the better units Oliver had put in a tractor of this class and era, and sell those components to the people who needed them. The front axle was a problem for whoever was going to put the tractor to work. It was not Vance's problem. He had done his arithmetic on the legal pad. The engine was worth approximately $130 to the right buyer. The transmission was worth $60 to $70. His time factored in. The number he had arrived at was $160, and that was his ceiling above which the extraction math stopped working. Cal did not know Vance's specific number, but he understood from watching Vance in the preview and watching him again now as the lots progressed that Vance was not a man who let the heat of bidding carry him past a number he had calculated in advance. The number was already fixed. The bidding would reveal it, but would not change it. That was the thing Cal needed to know about his opponent. Gord Lassiter reached Lot 14. He walked to the Oliver 88 with his catalog sheet and read from it in the neutral disclosing manner that was the Harlan Sale Barn standard. Lot 14, 1953 Oliver 88 row crop configuration. Engine runs. Front axle shows damage. Sold as is no warranty expressed or implied. Opening the bidding at $150. Silence. Not the waiting silence of a crowd that has been anticipating a lot. The settled silence of a crowd that looked at this tractor in the preview and has already formed its collective opinion. $100 then, Lassiter said. Still nothing. $75, folks. 1953 Oliver 88 engine runs. $75 to open. Cutter Vance raised his clipboard, a small economic motion. The motion of a man indicating a decision that was made before the bidding started. I have 75, Lassiter said. Looking for 80. Cal raised the slip of paper with his bidder number. He raised it the way he did everything at the auction, without theater, without the aggressive arm extension that some bidders use to signal their commitment. He raised it to shoulder height and held it there until Lassiter's eyes found it. The murmur that moved through the crowd near lot 14 was small but definite, enough to cause Dex Holbrook, positioned 2 rows away near lot 16, to turn around. "I have 80 from the young man in the north row, looking for 90. Vance raised the clipboard. 90, looking for 100. Cal raised his slip. 100 from the young man, looking for 110. Holbrook had turned completely around now. He was not going to bid. He had assessed this tractor and moved on, and his assessment had not changed. But he was watching with the attention of a man who has encountered something that does not fit his model of how a Tuesday morning auction is supposed to proceed. He was not the only one watching. The geometry of the crowd had shifted incrementally toward the north row in the way that crowds shift when something is happening that might matter. Vance went to 110. Cal went to 120. Vance looked at his legal pad. Not for long. The numbers were already there. He looked at the legal pad the way you look at a decision you have already made when you want to confirm that the conditions that justified the decision have not changed. They had not changed. He went to 130. Cal raised his slip. 140. The yard went quiet in a way that was different from the previous quiet. This was the quiet of people watching something they do not fully understand, waiting for it to resolve into something they do. Lassiter let the moment hold. He was a professional, and he understood that silence was doing work. Cutter Vance looked at the Oliver 88. He looked at it with the complete assessment gaze of his preview examination, running through the components he had priced: the axle, the fender, the plywood seat, the engine, the transmission. He looked at his legal pad. He looked at the boy standing beside the machine holding a slip of paper at $140. $140 was $20 below his ceiling. He had room to go higher. He should go higher by the arithmetic he had done. He looked at Cal one more time. Cal was not looking at Vance. Cal was not looking at the crowd. Cal was looking at the Oliver 88 with the same expression he had brought to the preview, the expression of someone who has already answered the question and is waiting without urgency for the room to catch up to the answer. Cutter Vance had been doing this for 20 years. He knew with the knowledge that 20 years of repetition produces in the mind of a careful and attentive practitioner when he was bidding against someone who had information he did not have. He could not name the information. He could not identify the source of the certainty in the boy's expression. But the boy had spent 22 minutes on this tractor in the preview with a compression gauge and a folding ruler, and he was standing at $140 on a machine that every experienced eye in the yard had walked away from. And his expression was not the expression of someone who is hoping. It was the expression of someone who knows. Vance lowered the clipboard. 140, Lassiter said. Looking for 150. No movement. 140 going once. The yard held its quiet like something fragile. Going twice. The gavel came down. The Oliver 88 lot, 14-1953. Engine runs, front axle shows damage, sold. As is, went to Cal Mercer, 16 years old, Oakley, Kansas, for $140. He had $200 remaining in the coffee tin. The bushing would cost $11.40 at the implement supply in Colby. The arithmetic had worked the way he had needed it to work, with a buffer that would cover whatever else the tractor revealed when he got it into the shed. He stood beside the Oliver and waited while Lassiter moved on to lot 15, and after a moment Dex Holbrook walked over. Not quickly. Holbrook moved the way he always moved, with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a man who does not rush toward things, because rushing suggests uncertainty about whether the destination is worth reaching. He came to lot 14 and stopped a few feet from Cal and looked at the tractor, and then at Cal, and what was in his expression was not dismissal anymore. It was something more like inquiry. "Son," he said, "that front axle is bent. You know that." He said it without condescension. He said it as a statement from a man who believed what he was saying and was trying to understand what the boy in front of him believed. "The axle's not bent," Cal said. Something shifted behind Holbrook's expression, not dramatically, but enough. "The kingpin bushing is worn," Cal said. "Looks the same from the outside. It's a different problem entirely." Holbrook looked at the front axle again, the way you look at something when someone has told you to look at it differently and you are trying to see what you have not been seeing. Which is harder than seeing something for the first time, because first seeing has no prior image to work against. How do you know that, he said. It was not a question in the rhetorical sense. It was a direct request for the specific information that had produced a specific conclusion. Oliver put out a service bulletin in 1956, Cal said. It describes this exact presentation in the 52 and 53 models. The tilt is a tolerance shift in the kingpin bushing, not impact damage. The axle itself is straight. I measured it this morning before registration. Holbrook was quiet. Not the quiet of a man who has stopped thinking. The quiet of a man who is thinking harder than usual because the information he has just received requires it. He could have dismissed what he was hearing. He had the standing to dismiss it, 14 years of standing, and the boy delivering it was 16 years old. He could have defaulted to his experience and the authority it carried. Most people in his position receiving a technical correction from a teenager would have done exactly that. Holbrook did not do that. He looked at the front axle a third time. You said you measured it. With a folding ruler, Cal said. The lateral cant is 4¼ inches at the wheel flange. The bulletin says 4 to 4½ inches indicates bushing wear, not structural damage. Several men had gathered at the edges of the conversation. The auction was still moving behind them. Lot 15 was going under the hammer, but Lot 14 had become its own event. A conversation that was drawing people the way conversations draw people, when the subject is something that matters specifically to the people near enough to hear it. These were farmers. Farm equipment was not abstract to them. What was being discussed at the edge of the north row was directly applicable to every piece of equipment any of them would ever evaluate, buy, or pass on. How much to fix it, Holbrook said. $12 in parts, Cal said. 3 hours of work if I take my time. The quiet that followed was the quiet of experienced men updating something. Not dramatically, internally. The quiet of a recalculation that no one was going to announce, but that was happening nonetheless in the minds of the men standing within earshot. Holbrook had walked away from Lot 14 after 30 seconds. That had been the correct decision by every standard available to him. An off-center front axle on a tractor of that vintage in a sale yard indicated damage. He had cataloged it and moved on. That was not carelessness. That was experience applied efficiently to a situation that appeared to have a clear answer. But experience applied efficiently is only as accurate as the information it is built from. And the information Holbrook's 14 years of experience was built from did not include a service bulletin issued in 1956 describing a specific failure mode in the 1952 and 1953 Oliver 88 Kingpin assembly. The bulletin had been issued when Holbrook was still in high school, before he had entered the equipment business, before there had been any reason for him to encounter it. He had not known what he did not know. That was not a failure. It was simply the boundary of what 14 years of general experience, however well organized, could contain. The gap between what Holbrook knew and what Cal knew was not a gap in industry or intelligence. It was a gap in one specific piece of information that had been available in print for 20 years to anyone who had read the right binder all the way to the right page. Holbrook looked at the boy standing beside the tractor. He was 16 years old, wearing slightly too large work boots, holding a notebook with compression numbers and a ruler measurement written in small, precise handwriting. He was not performing anything. He was not displaying the satisfaction of someone who has caught a more experienced person in an error. He was simply standing beside the machine he had just bought for $140, waiting for whatever came next with the patient stillness of someone who has learned that the work is the point, and what other people think of the work is a separate matter entirely. Dex Holbrook put out his hand. Cal shook it. "Where'd you learn that?" Holbrook said. "My grandfather, Earl Mercer, out of Thomas County. He kept every bulletin Oliver ever sent him." Something crossed Holbrook's face. Recognition or something adjacent to it. "I knew Earl Mercer," he said. Cal looked at him. "Good man," Holbrook said. "Yes, sir," Cal said. Holbrook held the handshake for one more moment and then released it and turned and walked back toward the auction without looking back and without saying anything else, because there was nothing else that needed to be said. The handshake was a complete communication in the language that men of a certain kind use in certain times and places to say things they will not say in words. Here is acknowledgement from a man who has been doing this since before you were in school, that you knew something real that he did not know, and that the knowing of it was legitimate and that it deserves the respect of being recognized. Cal watched him go. He turned back to the Oliver 88 and put his hand on the hood where the paint had worn all the way through to bare metal in an oval. The shape and size of a palm, the evidence of many hands laid in the same place across the same habit of checking temperature. The metal was already warm from the morning sun. He could feel the solidity of cast iron under his hand, dense and permanent, in the way that things made in that era were made to be. He had a receipt for it, $140, lot 14. The practical problem that presented itself in the following 20 minutes had nothing to do with axles or bushings. It had to do with the fact that Cal had ridden his bicycle 14 miles to get to the Harlan sale barn and was now the owner of a machine that weighed 3,400 pounds and needed to be moved 14 miles in the opposite direction before the barn closed at 5 o'clock. And he had no trailer, no truck, and no one at this auction he knew well enough to ask for that kind of assistance. He stood beside the Oliver and thought about this the way he thought about mechanical problems, which was to list what he had, list what he needed, and identify the connection between those two lists that required the fewest assumptions. What he had noticed when he arrived, that there was a flatbed trailer in the parking area attached to a truck with the particular configuration of a vehicle owned by someone who regularly hauled heavy equipment. He had noted the trailer because he noted things like that, because noting things like that was how you stayed aware of the options available in a situation. The trailer belonged to Cutter Vance, whose name Cal did not yet know, but whose truck and trailer he could locate from where he was standing. What he needed access to that trailer or something equivalent before 5 o'clock. What stood between those two things, a conversation with the man who had just spent 20 minutes in a bidding contest with him and had come out of it without the thing he had come for. Cal found Vance near the water tank on the east side of the yard, making notes on his legal pad about later lots in the sequence. Vance saw Cal coming and watched him approach with the same neutral, attentive expression he had worn all morning, which was the expression of a man who processes what is in front of him without a great deal of editorializing about whether it is what he would have chosen. "I need to get the tractor home," Cal said. "I came on a bicycle. I was wondering if you'd be willing to haul it. I'd pay you for your time and the fuel." Vance looked at him for a moment. Not long. He was not a man who took a long time to assess simple situations. "How far?" he said. 14 miles, outside Oakley." Vance finished the note he had been making before Cal arrived. He was a man who finished what he had started before redirecting his attention and set the mechanical pencil on the clipboard. "You said the axle isn't bent," he said. "That's right. Kingpin bushing." "Yes, sir." $12 in parts. $11.40 at the implement supply in Colby. "I checked the price last week." Vance looked across the yard at the Oliver 88 at the end of the north row, sitting with its plywood seat and its missing fender and its front axle tilted 4¼ inches at the wheel flange. "I want to watch you fix it," he said. Cal considered this for a moment. "All right," he said. Vance drove the flatbed to the Mercer farm 2 days later on a Thursday afternoon, after Cal had arranged with a neighbor to operate the loader tractor that would be needed to get the Oliver onto the trailer. They got the tractor loaded without incident and secured it and drove the 14 miles back to Oakley in the silence that exists between two people who do not know each other well enough for conversation and are both sufficiently comfortable with silence not to feel compelled to fill it with something that neither of them needs. Cal's equipment shed was at the back of the Mercer property behind the house and accessible from the farm road that ran along the east edge of the field. It was a solid wooden building that Earl had built in 1952 and maintained with the same care he brought to everything he maintained. The workbench ran the full length of the north wall. Earl's tool chest sat at the east end of the bench, the wooden chest he had built himself in 1941, its drawers organized exactly as Earl had organized them, and kept in that organization by Cal in the 2 years since Earl's death. The binders were on the shelf above the bench, organized by manufacturer and model year. Their spines labeled in the careful handwriting that Vance could see from the doorway was older than the boy who had brought him here. Vance stood inside the door and looked at the shed with the deliberate attention of a man reading a place the way you read a person, looking for what it tells you about who uses it and how. The organization, the specific cleanliness of a working space that is kept clean not for appearance, but because disorder costs time, and time costs money, and the person who works here understands that equation. The tools hung on the wall inside outlines that showed exactly where each one returned. The binders on the shelf, each one labeled, none of them out of sequence. "Your grandfather built this," Vance said. "Yes, sir. He kept it up. I've tried to keep it the same way." Vance did not say anything else about the shed. He found a position near the workbench where he was out of the way and close enough to see, and he stayed there. Cal got the Oliver off the trailer with the loader tractor, backed it into the shed to its working position, and started. The kingpin bushing replacement on a 1953 Oliver 88 is not a complicated procedure. It is not a simple one either. It occupies the middle category of mechanical work that rewards careful preparation and measured execution and does not punish a man who knows what he is doing and proceeds accordingly. Cal had read the service manual procedure 3 times before the auction. He had read it again the evening before Vance brought the tractor over. He knew the sequence the way you know something when reading it has become rehearsal. He began at 8:30 in the morning. Vance took his position near the bench and watched without speaking. The front wheel assemblies came off first, each component set down on the bench, in the order of removal, left side to right, each piece in contact with the one beside it, in the sequence it had come from the machine. This was Earl's method, and the reasoning behind it was Earl's reasoning. The order of disassembly is the map back to assembly. Deviation from that order creates confusion that costs time, and time spent on confusion is time not spent on the work. Vance watched the components go onto the bench in their ordered sequence and made no comment. The front axle access required working from below with the front end raised. Cal positioned Earl's floor jack under the axle center point and raised the front end until the wheels cleared the floor by 6 inches. He put jack stands under the frame rails before he went under the tractor. He did not work under a raised vehicle supported only by a jack. Earl had told him this exactly once in terms specific enough about the consequences that Cal had needed to hear it only once. The lesson was permanent. He slid under the front end on his back with the flashlight and looked at the kingpin assembly from directly below. He looked at it with the full attention appropriate to a piece of information he was verifying in a setting different from the setting where he had first obtained it. The preview yard at the Harlan sale barn had been a preliminary assessment under time pressure. This was his machine in his shed with all the time the job required. The lower bushing was worn to the point where the play in the assembly had produced the lateral shift. The upper bushing showed wear, but of a lesser degree. The kingpin itself was straight, no scoring, no evidence of impact damage to the pin or the housing. He slid back out, stood up, and wrote 2 notes in his notebook. Then he went to the tool chest. Earl's tool chest held 40 years of specific acquisition, each tool present, because it had been needed and bought at the point of need and maintained afterward, because maintaining a tool was the cheapest form of insurance against a future problem that could not yet be named. The kingpin bushing driver set was in the 3rd drawer on the left, wrapped in an oiled cloth. Earl had bought this driver set in 1958, 2 years after reading the bulletin that described the kingpin bushing issue on the Oliver 88. He had bought it before he needed it in anticipation of eventually needing it, which was the kind of forward thinking that Cal had recognized in the chest at 14 without having the language for it, and that he now had the language for because he had thought about it enough times in the intervening 2 years. Earl had prepared for what he knew was coming. Cal drove the worn lower bushing out with 3 measured strokes of the driver against a ball-peen hammer that had been Earl's father's before it had been Earl's. The bushing came out true without cocking in the bore. He examined the bore with the flashlight. No scoring, no elongation. The bore was clean and within specification. He set the worn bushing on the bench beside the new one he had bought in Colby the day before. The difference between them was visible. The old bushing had worn unevenly on its inner surface, concentrated on the thrust side, where the load transferred in turns. The metal thinned until the design clearance had become excessive clearance, and the excessive clearance had become the lateral shift that every experienced buyer at the Harlan sale barn had read as impact damage. Cutter Vance leaned forward slightly from his position near the bench. He looked at the 2 bushings with the attention of a man who is revising his understanding of something which is a different quality of attention from the attention of a man who is confirming what he already knows. Cal pressed the new bushing into the bore with the driver seating it square, driving it to correct depth in measured strokes, checking depth with a straight edge after each set of strokes. He did the upper bushing next, same precision, same patience. He reinstalled the kingpin. He reinstalled the wheel assemblies, torquing the hub nuts to specification with a torque wrench that he had had calibrated at the implement supply. The same afternoon he bought the bushing because Earl had believed in calibrated tools and had explained the belief specifically. A torque wrench that is off by 10% is a wrench that lies to you every time you use it. And a tool that lies is worse than no tool because it creates false confidence. Cal lowered the front end off the jack stands and rolled the tractor forward 18 inches on the shed floor and crouched at the front end and looked at the axle. It was straight. Not approximately straight. Straight. The lateral cant was gone completely. The wheel flange sat where the Oliver Engineering Department had intended it to sit when they built this machine in 1953, restored by $11.40 in parts and 2 hours and 40 minutes of work in a shed in Thomas County, Kansas. He stood up. Cutter Vance was looking at the front axle. He looked at it for a long time. He walked to the front of the tractor and crouched where Cal had crouched and looked at the geometry from that angle, and then stood up and looked at the alignment from the side, sighting down the length of the machine, the way you sight down the length of something when you are checking whether it is true. He came back to where Cal was standing. "Start it," he said. Cal primed the carburetor and set the throttle and pulled the hand crank through 2 compression cycles before engaging the starter, distributing oil through the upper engine before he put a load on it, because that was the right way to start an engine that had been sitting, and Earl had taught him why. The Oliver 88 turned over twice and caught. It settled into the idle of a 4-cylinder gasoline engine with good compression and a clean carburetor and fuel arriving in the correct amount and mixture. It did not smoke. The temperature gauge came up to operating range in 4 minutes and held there. Vance listened to it the way mechanics listen to engines, not for specific sounds, but for the overall character, the composite of all the components running correctly or incorrectly, which produces a signature that an experienced ear reads the way an experienced eye reads a face. He listened for 2 full minutes. "Pull it outside," he said. Cal drove the Oliver out of the shed and up the gravel track along the back of the property. The front axle tracked straight. The steering was what it was designed to be, responsive and centered without the wandering that worn kingpins produce. He drove to the end of the track, turned around in the field approach, came back. Vance was standing in the shed doorway. Cal stopped the tractor in front of him and let it idle. Vance looked at the front axle tracking straight on the gravel. He looked at the wheel alignment at rest. He looked at Cal. "I've been pulling axles off these for 10 years, Vance said. "Bought 3 of them in this county alone. Always thought the axle was the problem." He paused, and it was the pause of a man who does not speak often and is choosing his next words as carefully as he chooses everything else. "Never thought to check the bulletin." Cal did not say anything. The running tractor was saying it for him. Vance put his hands in his pockets and looked at the Oliver one more time. Then he nodded once in the brief, definitive way of a man acknowledging something that does not require commentary, and he walked to his truck and drove out of the yard without asking about payment for the haul. Cal did not offer payment again. He shut the tractor down and went back into the shed and cleaned the work area and returned the tools to the chest in the order they had come out. He put the worn bushing in the parts bin. He put the Oliver 88 service manual back on the shelf above the bench, open to the page, with Earl's notation in red ink, and he left it open there. He drove the Oliver up the county road that Sunday and came back listening to the engine at road speed with the attentiveness Earl had taught him, not listening for anything specific, listening for anything that should not be there. There was nothing that should not have been there. Steady, unhurried, prepared to work. He came back and shut it down in the yard and sat on the tractor for a moment in the Sunday quiet of a farm in late July, when the fields are between tasks and the air has not yet reached its afternoon weight, and there is a particular kind of stillness available that is not silence but close to it. 2 weeks later, a man named Gale Whitmore stopped at the Mercer place. He farmed 160 acres 2 miles north on the county road and needed a second tractor for his son's use, the boy coming onto the farm full-time the following spring. He could not afford newer. He needed something that would work reliably through a season without delivering surprises, and he had heard from a neighbor who had heard from someone else that there was a running Oliver 88 at the Mercer place. Cal showed it to him. Whitmore started the engine and engaged the PTO and drove it around the yard and up the track and back. He was a man who knew equipment, and the Oliver told him what it was prepared to tell a man who knew how to ask. He asked Cal what he wanted for it. "480, Cal said. Whitmore did not negotiate. A running Oliver 88 in this condition was worth $480 to a man who needed a second tractor and understood what a machine in this condition represented in terms of work remaining in it. The price was fair in the specific sense that it reflected actual value rather than either party's negotiating position. They shook hands. Whitmore wrote a check. He went to load the tractor onto his trailer and Cal watched him and then did something he had not planned to do. He walked over. "You know this machine," Cal said. It was not quite a question. Whitmore looked at him. "Oliver, man, my whole life," he said. "Had an 88 for 12 years before the transmission finally went. Good tractor." Cal nodded. Then, "You ever know a man named Earl Mercer out of Thomas County?" Whitmore set down the loading ramp he was positioning and looked at Cal directly. Something changed in his expression. "Earl Mercer," he said. "I knew Earl Mercer." He paused. "He do some work for you." "He was my grandfather," Cal said. Whitmore was quiet for a moment. He looked at Cal's hands the way a man who has known a great many men who work with their hands looks at the hands of someone new, reading what the hands say about the work. "Earl fixed a combine for me in the fall of '68, Whitmore said. "Problem 3 other men couldn't find. He found it in about an hour." He paused again. "He had a compression gauge he always used, old snap-on unit. He said his father-in-law gave it to him." Cal reached to his belt without speaking and unclipped the compression gauge that had hung there since the morning of the auction. He held it out. Whitmore looked at it for a long moment. "That's Earl's gauge," he said. He said it with the flat certainty of a man identifying something he has seen before, not guessing, not approximating. "He used it on my combine that fall. I watched him. I'd know that gauge anywhere." He looked at Cal. "He give it to you." "He left it in the tool chest," Cal said. "I found it when I took inventory after he died." Whitmore nodded slowly. He looked at the gauge for another moment and then looked at the tractor on the trailer and then at Cal, and there was something in his expression that was more than the transaction they had just completed. "He'd be pleased with this," Whitmore said. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. He picked up the loading ramp and finished loading the tractor. They shook hands once more before he drove out of the yard, and it was a different handshake from the one they had exchanged over the price. Cal stood in the yard and watched the Oliver go up the county road on Whitmore's trailer, and he held Earl's compression gauge in his hand, and he thought about the fall of 1968, 9 years before this morning, when Earl had unclipped this same gauge from his belt and pressed it against the cylinder of a combine that 3 other men could not diagnose, and Gail Whitmore had watched, and the machine had given up what it knew to the man who knew how to ask it. $140 in. $480 out. $11.40 in parts. Net $328.60. He clipped the gauge back on his belt and went back into the shed and got back to work. The story of what had happened at the Harlan sale barn moved through Harlan County and into Thomas County, the way useful information moves through farming communities faster and more accurately than people outside those communities generally expect. Farmers talk. They talk at the grain elevator when they are waiting for the truck to be weighed. They talk at the implement dealer's counter when a part is being looked up. They talk at the diner on the county highway where the booths fill up at 6 in the morning with men who have already been working for 2 hours and will work for 6 more, and have found in the 45 minutes of coffee and conversation something that sustains them through the day in a way that has as much to do with the company as with the caffeine. They talk about prices, they talk about weather, they talk about who has solved what problem and how, because solved problems are valuable in environments where problems are constant and solutions are scarce. The story had several components and all of them traveled. A 16-year-old boy had identified a misdiagnosed mechanical condition on a piece of equipment that every experienced buyer in the yard had walked away from. He had purchased it at the distressed price. He had repaired it for $12 in parts. He had sold it at full working value. The margin was substantial. The knowledge was specific and traceable to a service bulletin that had existed in print for 20 years, available to anyone who had read it. That last element was what lodged in people's minds. Not the profit, not the boy's age, the bulletin. The fact that the information had been sitting in a binder on a shelf for 20 years, accessible, complete, correct, and that the gap between reading it and not reading it had been worth several $100s in a single morning transaction and had made fools of nobody, but had simply revealed the difference between two kinds of knowledge and what that difference was worth when the right machine came up at the right auction at the right moment. By the time Cal started his senior year of high school in September of 1977, farmers he had not previously worked for were stopping at the Mercer place with problems they could not solve themselves, bringing them the way you bring problems to someone whose reputation has arrived before you have. He solved all of them. He did not charge for any of them. Two of the men paid him anyway, setting money on the workbench without comment when Cal's back was turned in the manner of men who do not accept assistance without finding a way to balance the account. In October, Dex Holbrook drove out to the Mercer place. Cal came out of the shed when he heard the truck and found Holbrook standing in the yard beside a trailer carrying a 1948 Farmall M with a cracked block. Holbrook had taken the tractor in on a trade the previous spring at a price that reflected its condition and had been unable to move it since. Parts dealers had offered him less than he had paid. He had been sitting on it for 5 months. He had heard about the Oliver 88. He stood in the yard and looked at Cal and said, "I've got a problem I can't solve." It was a different kind of statement than anything Holbrook had said at the auction yard. At the auction, he had been a man operating in his own territory from his own established authority. This was different. This was a man bringing a problem to someone who might be able to help with it, and the directness of the statement, no preamble, no qualification, no framing designed to protect his standing while asking for assistance, was itself a form of respect. "I'll need a couple of days to look at it," Cal said. "Take what you need," Holbrook said. They worked out an arrangement while Holbrook unloaded the tractor. Cal would assess the block situation and propose a repair path. If the repair was viable and the terms made sense for both of them, Cal would do the work and Holbrook would find the buyer and they would divide the resale value. The logic of the arrangement was visible without either of them needing to explain it. Holbrook drove out of the yard and Cal went into the shed and started looking at the Farmall. A cracked engine block is not automatically terminal. The outcome depends on the location of the crack, its extent, whether it has reached the water jacket or the cylinder bore, or the bearing saddles, and whether the location permits repair by pinning and sealing or requires replacement. Cal had read about block repair in 2 of Earl's binders and had found a more detailed technical reference at the Colby Public Library. He spent an evening at the library reading it carefully, making notes in his notebook, building a complete picture of the procedure before he began. The crack in the Farmall M block was above the rear cylinder and the water jacket accessible and not propagated into the bore. It was repairable. The repair required the right materials and the right preparation. And the preparation was the part most people got wrong because the preparation was time-consuming and had no visible result, and the temptation to skip it or abbreviate it in favor of getting to the part of the job that looked like progress was strong. Cal told Holbrook what he had found. Holbrook listened without interrupting. When Cal finished, Holbrook said, "Do it." The repair took 11 days. A crack pinning kit came from a supplier in Wichita, arriving 4 days after Cal ordered it. The surface preparation, cleaning, abrading, priming the crack area to the degree that the repair compound required for adequate adhesion took the better part of 2 days, during which nothing was visibly happening except a boy in a shed preparing a surface. He did not shortcut the preparation. The preparation was what the repair would stand on. A repair built on insufficient preparation was a repair that would fail at the worst moment and take with it the reputation of the person who had done it. Cal had a reputation now. It had formed on a Tuesday morning in July and had been added to in the months since. He was not going to damage it to save himself 2 days of invisible work. The Farmall ran when he finished. Not only repaired, he had addressed the carburetor, the magneto timing, and the front wheel bearings as well. Because he was in the machine and leaving known problems in place was a habit he did not intend to develop. When he was finished, it was a running, functional 1948 Farmall M that any farmer who needed a capable older tractor for a full season's work could use with confidence. Holbrook found a buyer within a week. A retired farmer in the east part of the county who needed something reliable for light work on a small property. The Farmall sold for $390. Holbrook's share was $235. Cal's was $155. Holbrook stopped in the yard before he left. "How long did the surface prep take?" he said. "About 2 days, Cal said. Holbrook nodded slowly. "Most people would have cut that in half." "The prep is what this repair stands on," Cal said. "The rest of it is just following through." Holbrook looked at him with the assessment expression, the one that had been recalibrating since July. "Your grandfather teach you that?" "He taught me everything starts with getting the surface right," Cal said. "The rest follows from that." They shook hands and Holbrook got in his truck. He stopped with the window down. "Earl taught a lot of boys over the years," he said. He was looking at the shed when he said it, at the binders visible through the open door. "None of them turned into you." Cal stood in the yard and did not answer. He had inherited from Earl the understanding that the correct response to a true statement was not another statement. It was the acknowledgement of having heard it communicated in the way Earl had always communicated such things in stillness, in the continuation of the work, in the absence of the need for more. Holbrook drove out of the yard. Cal went back into the shed. The Oliver 88 service manual was still on the shelf above the bench, open to the page with Earl's notation. He had not closed it. He sat on the stool at the end of the workbench and looked at the page in the October light that came through the south window, at the particular angle of October in Kansas, low and long, and making everything in its path look as though it had been there for a long time and would continue to be. He thought about Cutter Vance looking at the two bushings on the workbench, the worn one beside the new one, and updating his understanding of something without making a ceremony of the update. He thought about Holbrook's 30 seconds at Lot 14 and the 22 minutes he had spent there, and the gap between those two numbers and what lived inside that gap. He thought about Gail Whitmore holding Earl's compression gauge in the yard and saying, "That's Earl's gauge. He used it on my combine that fall." He thought about Earl buying the Kingpin bushing driver set in 1958, 2 years after reading a bulletin in preparation for a need that had not yet arrived and might not arrive for years, preparing for what he knew was coming. The particular kind of forward thinking that does not announce itself because it is not performed for an audience. It is simply done because it is the right way to approach the relationship between knowledge and time. By the time Cal graduated in the spring of 1978, he had completed 9 equipment repairs and sales through arrangements with Holbrook and 2 other dealers who had found their way to the Mercer place after hearing about the Farmall M. His share of those transactions, combined with what the Oliver had returned, had brought the coffee tin to $1,840. The coffee tin had moved to a locked compartment in the tool chest by then. Earl's tin, the original one, sat on the shelf above the binders holding miscellaneous fasteners. Cal had labeled it with a piece of tape and a marker, the label precise and small. He graduated in May and went back to the shed. The shed was his now in the full sense, though he did not think of the transition in those terms. He thought of it as the place where the work was, and the work had been there before him and would be there after, and his relationship to it was not ownership but continuation. The binders on the shelf had grown. He had found 3 additional Oliver bulletins at an estate sale in the spring of his junior year. A complete Minneapolis Moline service documentation set at a swap meet outside Colby. A Farmall technical reference at a used goods dealer in Hayes. He added each new binder to the shelf in its proper place by manufacturer and model year, labeled in his own handwriting, which was small and precise and distinct from Earl's, but not entirely unlike it. They were his binders now, which meant they contained Earl's binders as their foundation and beginning. In 1983, when Cal Mercer was 22 years old, he opened Mercer Agricultural Services in Thomas County, a plain name for a business that was by then anything but plain in its capabilities or its reputation. He did not advertise. He did not need to. The reputation had been building since July of 1977 through work that was done correctly and completely, and without shortcuts. And in a rural community, the reputation of a man who can fix what the dealerships cannot fix and will charge you a fair price for doing it travels at the speed of need, which is constant. The shed grew not in its physical dimensions, but in what moved through it. More machines, more manufacturers, more conditions that required specific knowledge to diagnose and specific procedures to repair. He found binders at estate sales and swap meets and occasionally at closing dealerships, and he read them all the way through, making notes in the margins alongside Earl's notes in the pages that already had them, adding his own observations to the accumulated observations of a man who had started this work 40 years before him. By 1988, 5 years into the business, there were 23 binders on the shelf. By 1993, 31. By 1994, when Dex Holbrook retired from the equipment business, there were 43. Holbrook drove out to the Mercer place on his last working day. Cal was in the shed when he heard the truck in the yard. He came out and found Holbrook standing in the October afternoon looking at the shed with the expression of a man doing a calculation that has nothing to do with money. They shook hands. It was the 3rd time they had shaken hands across 17 years. The first handshake had been at the Harlan Sale Barn in July of 1977, the acknowledgement from a man with 14 years in the business to a 16-year-old boy who had known something he had not known. The second had been in this yard in October of 1977 when the Farmall M deal had concluded. This was the third. Each of the three had meant something different, while meaning the same thing underneath, which was the acknowledgement between two men who respected the same things of what the other had done with the things they respected. Holbrook looked at the yard, at the shed, at the equipment visible through the open doors, three tractors in varying stages of work, an auger with a damaged flighting section, an implement waiting for a part that had been ordered the previous week. "I almost didn't shake your hand that day," Holbrook said. "At the barn, after the Oliver." Cal waited. "I thought you gotten lucky," Holbrook said. "Thought the bulletin was a coincidence. Right machine, right piece of information happened to line up. One-time thing." He paused. "I was wrong about that." Cal looked at the shed, at the 43 binders on the shelf above the bench, organized by manufacturer and model year. Each one read completely, each one containing the specific knowledge that made the difference between walking away after 30 seconds and spending 22 minutes finding what was actually there. "I got lucky that Earl kept his bulletins," Cal said. Holbrook shook his head, not impatiently, deliberately. "No," he said. "Earl kept the bulletins. A lot of men kept bulletins. You got lucky that you read them." He said it the way a man says something he has been carrying for a long time and has finally found the right moment to put down. "All of them. All the way through." Cal looked at the shelf. 43 binders where there had been a shelf of Earl's work and nothing else when he was 14 years old, and sitting on this stool in the evenings, reading for the company of a man who was no longer there to provide it in any other form. He had read for the company and stayed for the knowledge, and the knowledge had become a life's work in the way that the best things become what they become. Not through planning, but through paying full attention to what was directly in front of him and following it wherever it led, including all the way to the bottom. Holbrook drove out of the yard for the last time. The shed was quiet in the way it was always quiet after someone left, a specific quiet, the quiet of a space returning to itself after a visitor, which is different from the silence of a space that has never had one. The Oliver 88 service manual was in its proper place on the shelf, filed in the Oliver binder for 1953, organized by model year, exactly where it belonged. It had been moved there in 1979 when Cal reorganized the collection into its current system. He knew which binder it was in. He knew which page. He knew what was written there in red ink and handwriting that was not his own, and he knew it not because he thought about it often, but because it had been inside everything he had done in this shed since the winter of 1976, present in every assessment and every decision and every hour of work done correctly, when incorrect would have been faster. They'll always think it's the axle. It never is. Earl Mercer had kept the bulletins for 40 years. Cal Mercer had read them. He went back into the shed and back to work, and the work was what it had always been. Specific, patient, attentive to what was actually there, rather than to what it appeared to be built on the knowledge of one man transmitted to another across the particular medium of a wooden stool, in an evening light and a shelf of binders in a shed in Thomas County, Kansas, where the deepest knowledge is never the widest and never has been, and goes all the way to the bottom of one true thing and stays there long enough to understand it completely.